The rain had begun some time before dusk, settling over the city of Alexandria like a soft gray veil drawn gently across the eyes of the world. It started not with thunder or fury, but with the quietest suggestion of moisture in the air, a subtle thickening of the atmosphere, a faint coolness that crept through the narrow streets and open courtyards, touching the skin with the delicate fingers of an unseen hand. Those who had lived their lives along the Mediterranean coast recognized the signs immediately. They tilted their faces toward the sky, inhaling deeply, and smiled the private smiles of people who understood the language of weather. By the time the first drops fell, the city had already prepared itself in the way that ancient cities do, not with frantic scrambling or urgent shuttering of windows, but with a kind of collective, almost unconscious settling. Merchants in the great market near the harbor drew their cloth, covers a little tighter over their displays of dyed wool and carved ivory. Fishermen who had already returned to shore secured their boats with an extra knot or two, more out of habit than necessity. Children who had been playing in the dusty alleyways were called inside by mothers whose voices carried that particular tone, not angry, not worried, just knowing. That seemed to say, "Come now. The world is about to become soft, and you should be part of it." And in the great royal quarter, standing at the end of a long colonnaded walkway that seemed to stretch toward the sea itself, the library of Alexandria waited. It waited the way it always waited, with patience, with the quiet confidence of a place that had seen empires rise and fall, that had watched the comets streak across the summer sky, and the tides roll in and out without variation, that had accumulated within its walls the collected knowledge of the known world, and yet never once felt the need to boast about it. The library did not boast. It simply was. It existed in the way that mountains exist, or rivers, or the stars, with a permanence so fundamental that to question it would be like questioning the existence of air. But tonight, in the rain, it seemed somehow different, softer, more approachable. The great white limestone walls that usually blazed under the Egyptian sun like a declaration of intellectual supremacy were now muted, rendered in shades of pearl and silver by the diffused light of the overcast sky. The columns that lined the entrance, towering Corinthian marvels, each one carved with such precision that the acanthus leaves at their capitals seemed almost to flutter in a breeze that wasn't there. These columns glistened with a thin film of rainwater that made them look as though they had been polished by 1,000 careful hands. The rain fell steadily now, not in the violent downpours that sometimes came with the spring storms, but in a rhythm that was almost musical. It struck the broad, flat roofs of the library's outbuildings with a sound like distant applause. It dripped from the edges of the colonnades in an irregular but somehow soothing pattern, each drop landing on the worn stone, paving with a tiny, distinct sound that was immediately absorbed by the greater hum of the storm. It ran in thin rivulets down the steps leading to the main entrance, transforming those steps into miniature waterfalls, each one no wider than a finger, but possessed of a certain delicate beauty that would have been missed entirely by anyone walking too quickly or thinking too hard. And there was a man walking slowly up those steps. His name was Callistratus, and he was 43 years old, though if you had asked him, and nobody had recently, he would have told you that he felt both older and younger than that number suggested. He felt older because his back ached in the mornings, and because he had seen enough of the world to know its cruelties, its indifferencies, its casual destruction of beautiful things. But he also felt younger because tonight, standing in the rain outside greatest library the world had ever known. He felt something he had not felt in years. A genuine, unguarded sense of wonder. He paused on the third step from the top and looked back at the city spread out below him. Alexandria in the rain was a watercolor painting. All blurred edges and softened colors. The white buildings bleeding into the gray sky. The harbor disappearing into a mist that made it impossible to tell where the sea ended and the air began. The great lighthouse on Pharos Island, that impossible tower of light that sailors had navigated by for generations, was barely visible tonight, its beam reduced to a faint glow that pulsed through the rain like the heartbeat of something vast and sleeping. Callistratus breathed in. The air tasted of salt and wet stone and something else, something he could never quite name. The particular scent of ancient papyrus, perhaps, carried on the damp breeze from somewhere deep within the library's vaults. It was a smell that belonged to no other place on earth, a smell that spoke of knowledge so old it had become something other than knowledge, something closer to memory or to dream. He pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders and continued up the steps. The great doors of the library were already open. They were always open. In a sense, the Library of Alexandria did not close in the way that lesser institutions closed, with locked doors and extinguished lamps, and the sense of a place shutting down for the night. Instead, it simply shifted. The main reading halls would grow quieter. The scribes would lay down their reed pens and stretch their cramped fingers. The scholars who had been arguing about some point of geometry or philosophy or astronomy would gradually wind down their debates, not because they had reached conclusions. They rarely reached conclusions, but because the natural rhythm of the day had turned toward evening, and even the most passionate intellect must eventually yield to the body's need for rest and food, but the doors remained open, and there were always those who came and went at hours that others might consider strange. Insomniac philosophers, young students too excited by a new idea to sleep, travelers who had arrived on the evening boats and could not wait until morning to see the wonders they had heard about since childhood. The library accommodated all of them with the same quiet indifference, the same vast hospitality of space and silence, and the soft rustle of pages. Tonight, the doorway was guarded, if that was even the right word, by a man named Hephaestion, who was technically a member of the library's staff, but whose actual role was somewhat difficult to define. He was not a scholar. He was not a scribe. He was not a librarian in any sense that a modern person would understand. He was, instead, something more like a presence. He sat on a wooden stool just inside the entrance, wrapped in a woolen blanket that was far too large for him, and he watched the people who came and went with an expression of such complete and utter neutrality that it was almost impossible to tell whether he was paying attention at all. Evening, Hephaestion, Callistratus said, stepping through the doorway and shaking the rain from his cloak in a gesture that was more symbolic than practical, since the rain had already soaked through to his undergarments. Hephaestion looked at him. His eyes, which were the color of old bronze, moved slowly across Callistratus's face with the ponderous deliberation of a tortoise examining a lettuce leaf. Then he nodded a single economical movement of his chin and said, "Rain." Yes, Callistratus agreed. Rain. Good rain, Hephaestion added, and then returned his gaze to the middle distance, apparently considering the matter closed. Callistratus smiled. He had known Hephaestion for 11 years, and in that time he had never heard the man speak more than 4 or 5 words in succession. It was not Hephaestion was simple. Callistratus had seen him settle disputes between fractious scholars with a single raised eyebrow, and he had watched him identify a forged manuscript from across a room with nothing more than a glance at its binding. It was simply that Hephaestion had decided at some point in his life that most of what people said was unnecessary, and he had structured his entire existence around that observation. The entry hall of the library was vast, absurdly, almost comically vast, and yet it never felt empty. Perhaps it was the way the torchlight flickered against the walls, creating shadows that seemed to move with their own gentle purpose. Perhaps it was the sound of the rain, which followed you inside and echoed off the high ceiling in a way that made the space feel enclosed and protected, like the interior of a seashell. Or perhaps it was simply the knowledge of what lay beyond this hall, the knowledge that just through those archways, just down those corridors, just behind those wooden doors, there were hundreds of thousands of scrolls containing everything that the human mind had ever thought or dreamed or discovered. Callistratus paused for a moment in the center of the hall and closed his eyes. He listened. The rain was louder here than it had been outside, or at least it seemed louder because of the acoustics. The high vaulted ceiling caught the sound and reflected it downward, creating a dense cushion of noise that was somehow more peaceful than silence itself. It was the sound of a world being washed clean, of dust being returned to the earth, of all the small accumulated grimes and grits of daily life being gently, persistently, almost tenderly dissolved. He opened his eyes and walked on. The corridors of the library were a labyrinth, and not by accident. The building had been expanded so many times over the course of its existence. New wings added, old chambers subdivided, storage rooms converted into reading spaces, and back again. That its floor plan had become something that no single person fully understood. There were maps, of course. There was even a master map, kept in a locked room on the upper floor, that was supposed to show every corridor, every room, every stairway and alcove. But the master map was itself several decades old, and the library had continued to grow since it was last updated. And so there were now passages and rooms that existed only in the experience of those who had stumbled upon them. Hidden pockets of space that had been carved out of the building's generous margins and never formally recorded. Callistratus knew many of these hidden places. Not all of them. He suspected that no one knew all of them. Not even the head librarian. Not even the architects who had overseen the various expansions. But enough. Enough to navigate the corridors with a confidence that appeared, to the casual observer, almost supernatural. He walked now with a steady, unhurried stride, turning left at the second archway, then right at the statue of Aristotle, the one with the chipped nose and the slightly absurd expression, which the students had long ago nicknamed the thinker of small troubles, then left again down a narrow passage that was lit by only a single oil lamp, its flame wobbling in the slight draft that always moved through this part of the building. The passage opened suddenly into one of the smaller reading rooms, not one of the grand public halls where scholars debated and scribes copied and visitors gawked, but a private study that had been allocated to Callistratus several years ago by a head librarian who had since retired, and who had, in any case, never been entirely sure why he had given Callistratus the room in the first place. It was a modest space, perhaps 20 feet by 15, with a single window set high in one wall, too high to see out of, but just low enough to admit a thin blade of daylight during the morning hours. a wooden desk that had been scratched and stained by decades of use, 2 chairs that did not quite match, and a shelf that ran along the entire length of one wall and held approximately 200 scrolls. 200 scrolls in a library that contained, by the most conservative estimates, 400,000. The disproportion was almost comical, and Callistratus was aware of it every time he entered the room. These 200 scrolls were his world, his particular, peculiar, carefully curated corner of the vast ocean of human knowledge that surrounded him on all sides. They were mostly works of geography and natural history, with a smattering of philosophy and poetry that had insinuated themselves into the collection over the years through means that Callistratus could no longer entirely reconstruct. There was a treatise on the winds of the Libyan desert that he had read so many times the papyrus was beginning to soften at the edges. There was a poem about the Nile flood, written by a scribe whose name had been lost to history, that contained a single stanza so beautiful it had made Callistratus cry the first time he read it, and had continued to make him cry softly, without embarrassment, without even particularly wanting to stop, on every subsequent reading. There was a manual of navigation that was so badly organized that it was almost unreadable, but that contained, buried in its 7th section, a description of a harbor in southern Arabia that was written with such vividness and precision that you could smell the cinnamon and myrrh in its warehouses. These were his scrolls, his companions, his quiet, inanimate, endlessly patient friends. He set his wet cloak on the back of one of the chairs and sat down in the other. The desk was bare except for a reed pen, a small pot of ink that had probably dried out since yesterday, and a single scroll that he had left unrolled at the center His current reading, a work by a Greek traveler who had journeyed to the interior of Africa some 200 years earlier and had returned with accounts of rivers so wide you could not see the far bank, of mountains that seemed to touch the moon, of animals that defied every category the Greek mind had devised for the classification of animals. Callistratus had been reading this scroll for 3 weeks, not because it was long. It was actually quite short as these things went, but because he kept stopping. He would read a passage, and then he would stop, and he would sit very still, and he would think about what he had just read, and the thinking would carry him away to some place that was not entirely inside his own mind, and not entirely inside the scroll, but somewhere in the warm, liminal space between the two. And then the rain would remind him of where he was, a drop falling from the ceiling, or the sound of water moving through the gutter outside his high window. And he would blink and look down and realize that 15 minutes had passed, or 20, or 30, and that he had read only a single paragraph. This was, he had long ago decided, not a problem. This was, in fact, the entire point. He reached for the scroll now, but he did not unroll it further. Instead, he simply placed his hand on it, on the smooth, cool surface of the papyrus, which was slightly rougher where the ink had been applied, and smoother where it was blank. And he sat, and he listened to the rain. It was falling more heavily now. He could hear it on the roof above him, a continuous, layered sound that was not one sound at all, but many. A symphony of tiny impacts, each slightly different in pitch and volume and duration, blending together into a texture so rich and so complex that if you tried to listen to it analytically, tried to isolate individual drops or patterns, you would become lost almost immediately. The only way to hear the rain properly was to stop trying to hear it and simply let it in to open your awareness the way you open a window, and allow the sound to fill you without resistance, without analysis, without the constant human urge to name and categorize and understand. Callistratus let it in. He felt his shoulders drop. He felt the muscles in his jaw, muscles he had not even been aware were tense, gradually loosen. He felt his breathing slow, not through any deliberate effort, but simply as a natural response to the rain's hypnotic rhythm. The sound was everywhere now, on the roof, on the walls, on the window ledge, in the corridors outside his door, in the city beyond the library's walls, in the harbor, in the sea, in the air itself. It was as though the entire world had been wrapped in a blanket of water, and everything within that world, every person, every building, every tree and animal and stone was being held gently but firmly in a state of quiet, suspended peace. He thought briefly of his journey to Alexandria. It had been a long one, nearly 6 weeks by land from his home in the hills of Macedonia, across the Thracian plain, through the narrow passage of the Hellespont, along the coast of Asia Minor, then south through Syria and into Egypt. He had traveled alone, mostly, though there had been a few days in the company of a merchant caravan near Antioch, and a single night shared with a Roman soldier near Gaza, who had been trying to get home to some place Callistratus had never heard of, and who had talked about his farm with a tenderness that had made the stars seem brighter and the night seem less lonely. The journey had been hard in the way that all long journeys are hard, not dramatically, not with bandits or storms or any of the exciting dangers that make good stories, but with the slow, grinding accumulation of small discomforts, blisters that heal and then come back, dust that gets into everything no matter how carefully you wrap your belongings, nights when the ground is too hard the wind is too cold, and sleep comes only in brief, unsatisfying fragments that leave you feeling more tired in the morning than you were the night before. But the journey had also been beautiful, and it was the beauty that Callistratus remembered now. Sitting in his small room in the great library, listening to the rain, he remembered the morning in Thrace when he had woken before dawn and found the plain covered in mist, and he had walked through that mist for an hour with the sun rising behind him, turning the fog to gold and silver, and the only sound in the world had been his own footsteps and the distant call of a bird he could not identify. He remembered the afternoon in Asia Minor when he had climbed a small hill just to see what was on the other side. And what was on the other side was nothing, just more hills and more sky, and a river so far away it looked like a thread of silver laid across the green, and the nothingness of it had filled him with a joy so sudden and so overwhelming that he had sat down right there on the hillside and laughed out loud at the sheer improbable gorgeousness of the world. He remembered the night near Gaza, the Roman soldier's face in the firelight, the way the man's voice had changed when he talked about his olive trees, how it had become softer, lower, almost reverent, as though he were speaking of something sacred. And perhaps he was. Perhaps an olive tree tended by your own hands, that bore fruit you pressed into oil, that seasoned your bread and lit your lamp and anointed your skin, was a sacred thing. Perhaps the sacred was not something that existed only in temples and texts and the pronouncements of priests, but was also woven into the fabric of daily life, into bread and oil and firelight and the sound of rain on a roof and the smell of papyrus in a quiet room. These thoughts moved through Callistratus's mind the way the rain moved across the city, slowly, without urgency, without any apparent destination, following the contours of whatever they encountered, and then moving on. He did not try to hold on to them. He did not try to organize them into a system or a philosophy or a theory. He simply let them pass, and as they passed, they left behind a kind of residue. Not a thought exactly, but a feeling, a warmth, a sense of being present in a moment that did not need to be anywhere else or anyone else, because it was already complete. The rain continued. Somewhere in the library, a door closed softly. Footsteps passed along the corridor outside Callistratus's room. Light, quick footsteps that belonged to one of the younger students, probably, and then faded away. A gust of wind found its way through some crack or gap in the building's ancient masonry and caused the flame of the oil lamp to dance wildly for a moment before settling back into its steady, warm glow. The shadows on the walls shifted and resettled like birds, adjusting their positions on a branch. Callistratus reached for the scroll and unrolled it a little further, just enough to reveal the next section of text. The Greek traveler was describing a river crossing now. A simple, unremarkable passage from one bank to another, accomplished with the help of local guides in a canoe made from a single hollowed tree. The prose was plain, almost pedestrian, lacking the poetic flights that characterized some of the earlier passages. But there was a sentence near the end of the section that caught Callistratus's attention and held it. The river, I was told, goes on for many days' journey beyond the place where I turned back, and the people who live along its banks say that it has no end. But I think this must be a misunderstanding, for all things that flow must eventually come to rest. Callistratus read the sentence 3 times. He thought about it. He thought about the traveler sitting in some drafty room in Alexandria or Athens or Pergamon, writing these words by the light of a lamp, not so different from the one that now sat on Callistratus's desk. He thought about the traveler's certainty, the calm reasonable, almost weary certainty of a man who has seen the world and believes he understands its limits. All things that flow must eventually come to rest. It was the kind of statement that sounded obviously true. The kind of statement that you would nod at and turn the page without a second thought. But something about it troubled Callistratus, or not troubled exactly. Something about it stayed with him, the way a single note from a song can stay with you long after the song is over, echoing in some quiet chamber of your mind that you didn't even know was there. All things that flow must eventually come to rest. Was that true? Was it? The rain flowed, and it came to rest in the sea, in the soil, in the roots of plants, and the bellies of animals, and the cracks of stones. But then it evaporated, and it flowed again, and it came to rest again, and the cycle repeated endlessly without apparent purpose or conclusion. The river flowed, and it came to rest in the ocean. But the ocean itself was not at rest, was it? The ocean moved and heaved and churned and threw itself against the shores and stirred itself into storms and calmed itself into glassy stillness, and then stirred itself again. Where was the rest in that? And what about thought? What about the flow of ideas through the mind, through his mind, right now, at this very moment? Did that flow come to rest? It seemed to him that it did not. It seemed to him that the mind was like the rain. It fell, and it gathered, and it moved, and it dispersed, and then it fell again. There was no final resting place for a thought, no ultimate destination where all ideas arrived and stopped and said, "Yes, this is it. This is the end. There is nothing more to know or think or feel," unless there was. Unless the traveler was right, and all flows did eventually come to rest, and the reason it seemed otherwise was simply that the time scale was too large for a single human life to perceive. Perhaps the river did end. Perhaps the rain did come to its final, ultimate rest somewhere, not in any place that could be pointed to on a map, but in some condition of stillness that was so total, so complete, that it could not be distinguished from peace. The thought was a comfortable one, and Callistratus let it settle over him like an extra blanket. He did not pursue it. He did not try to resolve the contradiction between the flowing and the resting, between the movement and the stillness. He simply held both ideas in his mind at the same time, the way you might hold two smooth stones in your palms, and he let the weight of them press gently against the edges of his consciousness. The rain, as if in response, softened. It did not stop. It was not ready to stop, not yet. But it shifted from a steady downpour to something gentler, more intermittent. The sound on the roof became less dense, more spacious, like a conversation that has moved from earnest debate to quiet, friendly reflection. Individual drops became distinguishable again, not as separate events, but as members of a looser, more relaxed pattern, each one taking its time, in no hurry to reach the ground. Callistratus rolled the scroll closed and set it aside. He leaned back in his chair, the one that didn't quite match the other one, the one with the slightly uneven leg that made it rock very gently if you shifted your weight, and he let it rock back and forth, back and forth, a tiny motion, barely perceptible, but soothing in the way that all tiny, rhythmic motions are soothing, like the ticking of a clock, like the breathing of a sleeping animal, like the swell of the sea, seen from a great distance, rising and falling with a slowness that makes it seem almost stationary. He closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, there was not darkness, but a deep, warm red, the light of the oil lamp, filtered through the thin membrane of skin and blood vessel, creating a glow that was not unlike the light of sunset. It was a peaceful color, a color that suggested warmth without heat, visibility without clarity, presence without demand. He let his gaze rest on it, or rather, he let his attention rest on it, since there was nothing to see in the conventional sense, and he found that the red glow seemed to pulse very slightly in time with his heartbeat, and that this pulsing was itself deeply relaxing, a reminder that his body was alive and functioning and did not need his conscious direction to continue doing so. The rain spoke. It spoke not in words, of course. Rain does not speak in words, and Callistratus was not the kind of man to pretend that it did. But it spoke in the way that all persistent, rhythmic, natural phenomena speak, through the slow, cumulative effect of their repetition on a mind that has stopped trying to interpret and has simply surrendered to the experience of hearing. The rain said something about time, about the way time moves differently when you stop paying attention to it, expanding and contracting like a breath, so that a single minute can contain an eternity or an instant, depending on whether you are watching the clock or listening to the water. The rain said something about solitude, not the painful kind of solitude, the kind that comes from loneliness and disconnection, but the other kind, the kind that the old philosophers used to talk about when they spoke of the value of being alone with one's thoughts. A solitude that was not an absence, but a presence, a fullness, a richness of experience that could only be accessed when the noise of other people's expectations and demands had been washed away. The rain said something about rest, not sleep, not yet, but rest. That intermediate state between waking and sleeping, when the body is still and the mind is quiet, and the boundary between self and world becomes thin and permeable, like the surface of a pond at dawn, when the reflection of the sky is so perfect that you cannot tell where the water ends and the air begins. Callistratus hovered in that state now, rocking gently in his uneven chair, wrapped in the sound of the rain, warm in the small room with its 200 scrolls and its scratched desk, and its single high window, through which the gray light of the rainy evening fell like a benediction. He thought about the library around him, not in detail. His mind was too relaxed for detail, but in the way that you might think about a house you have lived in for many years, aware of its presence without needing to mentally walk through its rooms. He thought about the scrolls in their shelves and cabinets and storage vaults, 400,000 of them, maybe more, each one a human voice reaching across time, each one a small act of defiance against the impermanence of all things. People wrote because they wanted to be remembered. They wrote because they believed that their thoughts were worth preserving. They wrote because the act of writing transformed the fleeting, insubstantial stream of consciousness into something tangible, something that could be held in the hands and read by strangers in distant cities centuries after the writer had turned to dust. And here they all were, the poets and the philosophers and the mathematicians and the astronomers and the physicians and the historians and the travel writers and the cookbook authors and the letter writers and the joke collectors and the dream interpreters and the men and women who had simply felt the urge to set something down, to make a mark, to say, I was here, I thought this, I saw this, I felt this. Please remember. Callistratus felt a tenderness toward them all, a tenderness so vast and so undifferentiated that it was almost indistinguishable from the tenderness he felt toward the rain itself and toward the city beyond the walls and toward the Roman soldiers' olive trees and toward the misty Thracian plain and toward the sound of his own breathing in the quiet room. Everything was tender tonight. Everything was soft. Everything was held in the gentle, encompassing embrace of the rain, which fell and fell and fell, without judgment, without purpose, without end, and made the world into something that could be loved without reservation. A long time passed, or what felt like a long time, though in the rain time, the expanded time, the time that is not measured by clocks, it might have been only a few minutes. Callistratus did not know, and he did not care. The chair rocked. The lamp flickered. The rain fell. And then, from somewhere deep within the library, there came a sound that was not the rain. It was a voice, a single voice, singing. The melody was simple, almost childlike in its directness, and the words were in a language that Callistratus did not recognize, though it might have been Egyptian or Phoenician or some dialect of Greek so ancient that its vocabulary had shifted beyond recognition. The voice was low and unhurried and slightly rough, as though the singer had been awake for a very long time and had passed beyond fatigue into that calm, clear state that sometimes comes on the other side of exhaustion. It was not a beautiful voice, exactly. It was too imperfect for that, too human, too marked by the particular grain and texture of an individual throat. But it was a true voice, a voice that sang because singing was what it needed to do at this moment, on this rainy night, in this great library filled with the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The sound floated through the corridors like smoke, rising and falling, sometimes audible and sometimes fading into the rain, never insistent, never demanding attention, simply there, offering itself to anyone who cared to listen. Callistratus listened. He did not try to identify the singer or understand the words or even follow the melody. He simply let the sound wash over him. Another layer in the already rich texture of the night. The rain on the roof. The whisper of wind through the gaps in the stonework. The distant song of an unknown voice. And beneath it all, like the bass note in a piece of music, the deep, abiding silence that held everything else in place. The song ended, or perhaps it didn't end, but that simply moved beyond the range of hearing, like a boat sailing over the horizon, still there, but no longer visible. The rain filled the space it left behind, and the silence returned, and Callistratus realized that he was more relaxed than he had been in months, perhaps years, perhaps ever. His body felt heavy in the way that bodies feel when they are on the verge of sleep. Not unpleasantly heavy, but weighted, grounded, as though his bones had finally accepted that they did not need to hold themselves upright anymore, and could safely surrender to the pull of the earth. He opened his eyes. The room was dimmer now. The oil lamp was burning low, its flame reduced to a small, steady point of orange light that cast shadows so faint they were barely distinguishable from the natural darkness gathering in the corners of the room. The rain had slowed further, settling into a pattern so gentle and so fine that it was almost like mist falling. Each drop so small and so light that it made no individual sound, but contributed to a general atmosphere of moisture and softness that seemed to blur the edges of everything it touched. Callistratus stood up. His legs were stiff, and there was a brief, sharp twinge in his right knee, a reminder that 43 was not 23, no matter how young the mind might feel. He crossed the room to the shelf and let his fingers trail along the scrolls, touching each one briefly, the way you might touch the spines of books on a shelf without any intention of pulling one out, just to feel them, just to acknowledge their presence, just to maintain the connection between your body and the physical objects that contain the thoughts you love. His fingers stopped at the poem about the Nile flood. He hesitated, then smiled, and left it where it was. Not tonight. Tonight was not a night for weeping. Even the sweetest, most nourishing kind of weeping. Tonight was a night for something else, something harder to name, but no less valuable. Something that was perhaps best described as receiving. He had spent the evening receiving the rain, receiving the silence, receiving the distant song, receiving the warmth of the lamplight, and the comfort of the familiar room, and the accumulated presence of the 200 scrolls. He had been given something, not a gift exactly, because a gift implies a giver, and there was no giver here. There was only the world being itself, doing what it does, rain falling, and people sitting, and buildings standing, and time passing. But something like a gift, something that had arrived unbidden and unexpected, and that could not be returned or exchanged or set aside, but could only be accepted with the quiet grace of a person who understands that the best things in life are not earned or achieved, but simply noticed. He turned from the shelf and looked around the room one last time. The desk with its dried ink and its reed pen. The 2 chairs, mismatched and beloved. The high window with its thin blade of gray light. The scroll on the desk, rolled closed, waiting with infinite patience for him to return and read the next section, and the section after that, and the section after that, for as long as it took, for as many evenings as were needed. The shelf with its 200 voices, each one silent now, but ready to speak at the slightest unrolling of papyrus. "Good night," he said softly. He was not sure whether he was speaking to the scrolls, or to the room, or to the library itself, or to the rain, or to no one at all. It did not matter. The words were not information. They were not communication. They were simply a sound, a small human murmur released into the great silence of the rainy night, where they would be absorbed and dispersed and transformed into something else, heat, perhaps, or vibration, or nothing at all, just as the rain would be absorbed by the earth and transformed into soil and root and flower and fruit and rain again, endlessly beautifully, without beginning and without end. He picked up his cloak. It was still damp, and it smelled of rain and stone and the faintest trace of salt from the harbor. He pulled it around his shoulders and walked to the door. And as he reached for the handle, he paused. From outside, from beyond the library, beyond the city, beyond the harbor and the lighthouse and the dark, rain-swept sea, there came a sound so low and so deep that it was felt rather than heard. Thunder. Not the sharp, startling crack of a nearby lightning strike, but the distant, resonant rumble of a storm that was still far out at sea, rolling its slow, majestic way toward the coast. It lasted a long time, 10 seconds, maybe 15, maybe longer, since time in its presence became unreliable. And then it faded, and the rain was the only sound again. But the rain was different now, fuller, deeper, as though the thunder had added a new dimension to it, had reminded it that it was part of something larger than itself, something that included not just this city and this library and this man, but the entire circumference of the sky and the full depth of the sea, and all the forces that moved between them. Callistratus stood at the door for a long moment, one hand on the handle, his body perfectly still, his mind perfectly quiet. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the corridor. The hallway was empty. The oil lamps that lined the walls at regular intervals had burned low, and the ones at the far end had gone out entirely, leaving a stretch of darkness that the eye could not penetrate. The rain was louder out here, with fewer walls and ceilings to muffle it, and the sound bounced off the stone floor and the plastered walls and the wooden doors of the other study rooms, creating a complex, echoing texture that was almost architectural in its precision. as though the rain were not falling on the building, but growing out of it, rising from the stones themselves like a fountain of sound. Callistratus walked slowly. He had no destination, or rather, his destination was simply out of the library, out into the rain, into the night. He did not want to go back to his lodgings in the city, not yet. He did not want to find a tavern or a friend's house or a warm bed. He wanted to walk. He wanted to feel the rain on his face. He wanted to be part of the night, to dissolve into it the way ink dissolves into water, losing its edges, losing its form, becoming something other than what it was. He passed through the entry hall. Hephaestion was still there, still on his stool, still wrapped in his absurdly large blanket. His bronze eyes tracked Callistratus's progress across the hall with the same unhurried deliberation as before. Leaving, Hephaestion said, "Just for a walk," Callistratus said. Hephaestion considered this. "Rain," he observed. "I know. Good rain for walking." Callistratus smiled. "You think so? The best kind of rain for walking. No sun, no wind, just rain." Callistratus looked at the old man for a moment, really looked at him in a way he hadn't quite done before. And he saw something in those bronze eyes that he had always sensed, but never fully acknowledged. A depth of experience, a breadth of understanding, a kind of wisdom that had nothing to do with scrolls or scholarship or the organized pursuit of knowledge, and everything to do with simply being present, day after day, year after year, in this place, watching the people come and go, listening to the rain, saying very little and understanding a great deal. "Thank you, Hephaestion," Callistratus said quietly. The old man blinked. It was the closest he ever came to expressing surprise. Then he nodded, 2 nods this time, a distinct increase in his normal rate of acknowledgement and said, "Sleep well." "I will," Callistratus said, and he meant it, though he had no intention of sleeping any time soon. He stepped through the great doors and out into the rain. It was wonderful. There was no other word for it. The rain fell on his face and his hands and his hair, and it was wonderful, not exciting, not dramatic, not the kind of experience that makes you want to shout or laugh or run, but the other kind of wonderful, the quiet kind, the kind that fills you from the inside out with a feeling that is so simple and so fundamental that language strains to contain it. It was the feeling of being alive, not alive in the sense of having a pulse and functioning organs, but alive in the deeper sense, the sense that the philosophers talked about when they distinguished between merely existing and truly living. The sense of being completely, vividly, unmistakably present in your own life, in your own body, in your own moment of time. Callistratus walked down the steps of the library, each one slick with water, and he did not slip because he was walking slowly enough to feel the texture of the stone beneath his sandals, to adjust his weight with each step, to move in harmony with the wet surface rather than in opposition to it. He reached the bottom and turned left toward the gardens that lay between the library and the royal palace. The Mousian Gardens, as they were known, named after the temple of the Muses that stood at the heart of the complex. The gardens were empty, of course. It was late, and the rain was steady, and no sensible person would choose to be outdoors at this hour. But Callistratus was not sure he was a sensible person, at least not tonight. Tonight he was something else, something less defined, less bounded, less constrained by the practical considerations that normally governed his behavior. Tonight, he was a man walking in a garden in the rain, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The paths were gravel. the rain had softened them so that his footsteps made almost no sound, just a faint, satisfying crunch that was immediately absorbed by the greater sound of the water falling on the leaves and branches of the trees and shrubs that lined the path. The garden was lush, even in this season, tended by a staff of gardeners whose skills were, in Callistratus's opinion, every bit as impressive as the scholarly achievements of the library's more celebrated residents. There were olive trees, their silver leaves flashing in the lamplight like small mirrors. There were fig trees, their broad leaves cupping the rain and releasing it in sudden, heavy splashes when the weight became too great. There were beds of herbs, rosemary and thyme and basil, whose scent was intensified by the moisture in the air, creating a rich, green, living fragrance that rose from the ground like an exhalation. Callistratus breathed it in. He breathed in the rain and the rosemary and the wet stone and the faintly mineral smell of the gravel path, and he felt his lungs expand to their fullest capacity, and he felt the air move through his body like a tide, bringing oxygen to places that had been starved of it for hours or days or weeks, or perhaps for his entire adult life, which had been spent largely indoors, largely hunched over scrolls, largely in the company of the dead rather than the living. He kept walking. The path curved gently to the right, following the line of a low wall that marked the boundary of the garden. Beyond the wall, he could see the roofs of the city, their tiles dark and gleaming with rain, stretching away toward the harbor, where the masts of the anchored ships swayed gently, their rigging dripping with water that caught the light of the harbor lamps and sparkled like strings of tiny jewels. The sea itself was invisible, lost in the mist and the darkness, but its presence was felt in the saltiness of the air and in the deep, rhythmic sound of the waves breaking against the harbor wall, a sound that was so constant, so much a part of the background, background of life in Alexandria that most people no longer noticed it at all. Callistratus noticed it. He noticed everything tonight. The way the rain collected in small pools on the flat surfaces of the wall's coping stones, each pool a perfect circle, each circle a tiny mirror reflecting the gray sky. The way a single leaf, a fig leaf, large and palmate, and a deep, glossy green, had fallen from its tree and landed on the gravel path where it lay face up, catching the rain in its veins and channels and transforming each one into a miniature river, a complete hydrological system in miniature, a world within a world within a world. The way the lamplight from the nearby palace cast long shadows that reached across the grass like dark fingers, and the way the rain fell through those shadows and was briefly, momentarily invisible before emerging on the other side and catching the light again, as though it had passed through a tunnel. He stopped walking and stood still. The rain fell on him. It fell on his head and his shoulders and his back and his arms and his hands and his face. It ran down his forehead and into his eyes, and he did not wipe it away. It ran down his cheeks and off his chin and onto his chest, soaking through his tunic, and he did not mind. It ran down his legs and collected in his sandals and squelched between his toes with each step. And it was fine. It was more than fine. It was right in some way that he could not articulate, and did not need to articulate because his body understood it, even if his mind could not quite grasp it. The body knows things that the mind does not. This was a truth that Callistratus had encountered many times in his reading. The old physicians wrote about it, and the athletes, and the dancers, and the musicians. But it was a truth that he had only rarely experienced directly, because he was, by temperament and training, a man of the mind. He lived in his thoughts. He navigated the world through ideas. His primary relationship with his body was one of mild, chronic neglect, punctuated by occasional episodes of discomfort that reminded him, with varying degrees of urgency, that he had won. But tonight, standing in the rain in the Mousian garden, he felt something shift. Not dramatically. There was no flash of insight, no sudden awakening, no transformative moment of the kind that mystics and visionaries described. Just a shift, a slight, almost imperceptible redistribution of attention from the head to the body, from the thinking to the feeling, from the interpreting to the experiencing. His shoulders relaxed further, his jaw unclenched, his hands, which had been half curled into fists at his sides. When had they done that? Opened and hung loose and free. His belly, which he had been holding in as he always held it in, as though by sheer abdominal tension he could make himself appear thinner, and therefore more acceptable to a world that he knew intellectually did not care about the circumference of his midsection, but that he felt emotionally judged him constantly. His belly softened and expanded, and he breathed into it, and the sensation was so unfamiliar and so unexpectedly pleasurable that he almost laughed. He did not laugh, but he smiled, a real smile, not the polite, social smile that he wore in the library's hallways and the city's marketplaces, but a private smile, an internal smile, a smile that was felt in the chest rather than displayed on the face. The rain fell. He stood. That was all. That was everything. After a while, a long while, a short while, it did not matter. He began to walk again. He followed the path deeper into the garden, past a small fountain that was overflowing with rainwater, its basin brimming and its water spout still trickling feebly, as though it had not yet received the message that nature was handling the irrigation tonight. He passed a stone bench, its surface dark with wetness, and he thought about sitting down, but decided to keep walking. He passed a statue of one of the muses, Calliope, perhaps, or maybe Clio. It was hard to tell in the dim light and the rain. And besides, the distinction between the muse of epic poetry and the muse of history seemed less important tonight than it usually did. He passed a clump of papyrus reeds that had been planted in a shallow basin of water, and he paused to look at them, really look at them. Because these reeds, these unremarkable, commonplace reeds, were the raw material from which the library's 400,000 scrolls had been made. Every thought that had been preserved in this place, every poem and every theorem and every observation and every story had been written on the inner pith of a plant, very much like the ones growing in front of him, sliced thin and dried and pressed and glued together into sheets that could hold the marks of a reed pen, the way skin holds a scar. It was an extraordinary thought, and Callistratus allowed himself to have it fully, to feel its weight and its wonder before moving on. The path led him to a small clearing, a circular space, perhaps 30 feet across, paved with smooth stones and surrounded by a ring of cypress trees whose dark, columnar forms rose into the rain like the pillars of a natural temple. In the center of the clearing stood a sundial, its bronze gnomon pointing uselessly at the obscured sky, its hour markings rendered irrelevant by the darkness and the clouds. But the sundial was beautiful anyway, not in spite of its uselessness, but because of it, because it was a reminder that there were other ways of measuring time besides the precise, mechanical division of the day into hours and minutes. There was the time of the rain, which knew no hours. There was the time of the body, which had its own rhythms and tides. There was the time of the mind, which could expand a moment into an eternity or compress a lifetime into an instant, depending on the quality of attention that was brought to bear. Callistratus stood in the center of the clearing, next to the sundial, and he looked up at the sky. He could not see the stars. The cloud cover was too thick, too complete. But he knew they were there, the same stars that had watched over the building of the pyramids, that had guided Phoenician sailors across the open Mediterranean, that had inspired Greek philosophers to calculate the circumference of the earth and to speculate about the nature of the cosmos. They were there, hidden behind the rain, and the rain was beautiful, and the hidden stars were beautiful, and the fact that you could not see one because of the other did not diminish the beauty of either, but rather added to it, creating a layered, complex beauty that included both the visible and the invisible, both the near and the far, both the present moment and the vast, unreachable distances of space and time. He lowered his gaze. The rain was lighter now, barely more than a drizzle, a fine, almost weightless mist that hung in the air and settled on the skin like a cool, gentle touch. The thunder had not returned, and the wind had died completely, and the only sounds were the drip of water from the cypress branches and the distant, ever-present murmur of the sea. Callistratus felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, completely at peace. Not the peace of exhaustion, though he was tired. Not the peace of resignation, though he had experienced that often enough in his life. Not the peace of distraction or oblivion or chemical induction, but the peace of a mind that had stopped fighting. Stopped fighting the rain. Stopped fighting the darkness. Stopped fighting the passage of time and the limitations of the body and the imperfections of the world and the nagging, persistent, exhausting effort to make things be other than they were. Things were what they were. The rain was falling. The night was dark. The library was full of scrolls walls that would still be there in the morning. The bed at his lodging would still be waiting for him whenever he chose to return to it. The world would continue to be beautiful and terrible and incomprehensible and heartbreaking and hilarious and absurd and glorious in varying proportions for as long as he lived and for long after he was gone. And right now, in this moment, standing in a circle of cypress trees in the rain, none of that mattered. Not because it was unimportant, but because it was not here. It was elsewhere in the past, in the future, in the realm of thought and speculation and anxiety and hope. But here in the clearing, there was only the rain and the darkness and the sound of water dripping from branches and the feeling of wet clothes against skin and the smell of cypress and rosemary and wet earth and the slow, steady rhythm of his own breathing, in and out, in and out, in and out, a rhythm that had begun at his birth and would continue until his death, and that required no effort and no thought and no will, that was simply happening, had always been happening, would always be happening, as natural and as necessary and as beautiful as the rain. He stood there for a long time, and then slowly, with no sense of urgency or obligation, he turned and walked back along the path. He passed the papyrus reeds and the statue of the Muse and the overflowing fountain and the stone bench, and he left the garden through a small gate in the low wall, and he walked through the wet streets of Alexandria toward his lodgings. The city was silent. The rain had driven everyone inside, and the streets that were usually crowded with people and animals, and the 1,000 small commotions of urban life were empty and clean and glistening, their stone surfaces reflecting the light of the few lamps that still burned in windows and doorways. Callistratus walked through this silence like a man walking through a dream, not frightened, not lost, not searching for anything, simply moving, placing one foot in front of the other, letting the wet streets guide him home. He passed a bakery that was closed, but still emitted the faintest aroma of bread, and the smell was so deeply comforting that he stopped for a moment and breathed it in, and he thought about the baker. Whoever they were, whatever their name, wherever they were at this hour, probably sleeping, probably dreaming of dough and ovens and the familiar rituals of their craft. And he felt a wave of affection for this unknown person, this stranger whose labor had fed him on mornings when he had been too absorbed in his reading to remember to eat, and who would feed him again tomorrow, and who did not know his name, and had no reason to care about his existence, but who contributed nonetheless to the vast, invisible web of human interconnectedness that sustained all of them, all the time, without anyone ever pausing to acknowledge it. He passed a temple, a small one, dedicated to some minor deity, whose name he could not read in the darkness, and he paused to look at it. The columns were wet, and the pediment was wet, and the steps leading up to the entrance were running with water, and the whole structure looked less like a building and more like a feature of the landscape, as natural and as unself-conscious as a cliff face or a waterfall. Rain collected in the grooves of the carved letters above the doorway, and the letters became tiny channels, and the channels became tiny streams, and the streams merged and separated and merged again in patterns that were too complex to follow, but too beautiful to ignore. He passed a house with an open window, and through the window he could hear the sound of someone snoring, a deep, regular, almost musical snoring that spoke of profound and untroubled sleep. And he smiled, and he felt a kinship with the snorer, a sense of shared humanity that transcended the boundaries of identity and circumstance, because sleep, like rain, was one of the great equalizers, one of the experiences that reminded you that beneath all the differences of class and education and profession and belief. There was a common substrate of human experience that connected everyone to everyone else. He passed a cat. The cat was sitting on a windowsill, perfectly still, its eyes reflecting the lamplight with a pale, greenish glow. It watched Callistratus approach with the expression that only cats can achieve, an expression of complete self-possession, of total comfort in its own skin, of absolute certainty that it belonged exactly where it was, and that the rest of the world could arrange itself accordingly. Callistratus stopped and looked at the cat, and the cat looked at Callistratus, and for a moment, a brief, wordless, rain-soaked moment, they understood each other perfectly. The cat understood that Callistratus was a man who had been walking in the rain and was tired and was at peace. Callistratus understood that the cat was a cat and needed no further justification for its existence. It was, under the circumstances, a remarkably satisfying exchange. "A good night," Callistratus said to the cat. The cat blinked slowly, the feline equivalent of a nod from Hephaestion, and turned its gaze back to the rain. Callistratus's lodgings were in a modest building near the eastern edge of the royal quarter, a 15-minute walk from the library on a dry night, and perhaps 20 minutes in the rain, though he was not counting. The building belonged to a widow named Theno, who rented rooms to scholars and travelers, and who had a reputation for discretion, cleanliness, and a breakfast of fresh figs, and goat cheese that was, in Callistratus's considered opinion, worth the price of the room by itself. He reached the building and stood at the entrance, looking up at it. It was a simple structure, 3 stories, whitewashed walls, wooden shutters, a clay tile roof that was producing a steady cascade of water from its eaves. It was not beautiful in the way that the library was beautiful, or in the way that the temples and the palaces were beautiful. It was beautiful in a different way, in the way that functional, ordinary, human-made things are beautiful when they are well made and well maintained and inhabited by people who care about them. The shutters were straight and firmly closed. The whitewash was fresh and even. The door frame, though plain, had been painted a deep blue that contrasted handsomely with the white walls, and that gleamed richly in the lamplight from within. He opened the door and stepped inside. The entrance hall was small and warm. A single oil lamp burned on a wooden shelf, and beneath it, in a shallow ceramic dish, there was a small offering to Hestia, a few grains of barley, a drop of olive oil, a pinch of salt. Thino was not particularly religious, but she maintained the household shrine with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. And Callistratus had always found the sight of it, this small, quiet acknowledgement of the sacred, in the context of the domestic, deeply moving. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, his wet sandals making a soft, squelching sound on each step. His room was at the end of a short corridor, a small room, even smaller than his study at the library, with a bed, a table, a chair, a window that looked out over a narrow alley, and a single shelf that held a handful of personal items, a change of clothes, a writing kit, a small wooden figurine of Hermes that his mother had given him when he was a boy, and a dried sprig of rosemary that he had picked in the garden of his family home in Macedonia on the day he left, and that still, after all these weeks of travel, retained a faint trace of its scent. He closed the door and stood in the room and listened. The rain was different here than it had been in the garden or the library, closer, more intimate, a private rain for a private space. It fell on the roof directly above his head, and the sound it made was not the vast, symphonic wash of the open sky, but a quieter, more focused patter, like fingers drumming on a tabletop, or like the sound of a heartbeat heard through a thin wall. He peeled off his wet clothes. The tunic came away from his skin with a faint, sucking sound, and the air that touched his bare torso was cool and clean, and felt wonderful against the damp warmth of his body. He toweled himself dry with a cloth that Theno provided, rough but clean, like everything in her establishment, and he put on a dry sleeping garment, and he sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was stuffed with straw, and was firm in the way that ancient mattresses were firm, which is to say very firm, almost unyielding, so different from the soft, yielding surfaces that modern people take for granted. But Callistratus had slept on this mattress for 3 nights now, and his body had already begun to adapt to it, to find the positions that worked, to appreciate the way its firmness supported the spine and kept the joints aligned. There was a lesson in that, he thought, the lesson that comfort is not a fixed standard, but a negotiable one, that the body is far more adaptable than the mind usually allows, and that what feels uncomfortable at first can become, with time and patience and the simple willingness to stop resisting, not just tolerable, but genuinely restful. He lay down. The bed was narrow, just wide enough for one person, and the blanket was thin, but the room was warm enough, and the rain was loud enough to fill the silence, and his body was heavy enough with the weight of the evening's experiences that sleep did not feel like a distant goal, but like an immediate, welcoming presence, hovering just at the edge of consciousness, waiting to be let in. He let it in, not all at once. Sleep rarely comes all at once for a mind as active as Callistratus's, but gradually, gently, the way the rain had begun, with a subtle thickening of the atmosphere, a faint blurring of the edges, a slow, soft dissolution of the boundary between waking and dreaming. Thoughts continued to move through his mind, but they moved more slowly now, like leaves caught in a gentle current, turning and drifting without urgency or direction. The library, the scrolls, the singing voice, the garden, the cypress trees, the cat, the sundial, the baker's bread, the Roman soldier's olive trees, the misty Thracian plain, the rain on the roof, the sound of his own breathing, the warmth of the blanket, the darkness behind his eyelids. These images and sensations floated past him, one after another, each one vivid for a moment, and then fading, replaced by the next, like the scenes in a dreamscape that has not yet fully committed to being a dream. They were not connected by any narrative thread. They did not build toward a conclusion. They simply were, and then they were not, and then something else was, and then that was not, and the spaces between them, the gaps, the silences, the moments of pure, undifferentiated darkness grew longer and longer and longer. The rain continued to fall. It fell on the library and the palace and the temples and the houses and the streets and the harbor and the sea. It fell on the ships at anchor and the lighthouse on Pharos and the gardens of the Mousian and the cypress trees in the clearing and the sundial that could not tell the time. It fell on the cat on the windowsill and the snoring man in his bed and the baker in her sleep and Hephaestion on his stool and the unknown singer somewhere deep in the library's labyrinthine corridors. It fell on Alexandria and on Egypt and on the Mediterranean and on the whole wide, rain-washed world. And it fell without purpose and without end and without malice and without mercy. And it was neither good nor bad, but simply rain. And rain was enough. Rain was more than enough. Rain was the world reminding itself that it was alive, that it was capable of beauty, that it could wash itself clean and start again, not because it had done anything wrong, but because renewal is the nature of water, and water is the nature of rain and rain is the nature of this night, and this night is the nature of now. Callistratus slept. He slept deeply and peacefully, and without dreams. Or if there were dreams, they were so gentle, so seamlessly woven into the fabric of sleep itself, that they left no trace, no residue, no memory of their passing. His body sank into the mattress. His breathing slowed to the long, deep rhythm of true rest. His face, usually creased with the subtle tensions of an active, questioning mind, smoothed out, and in the lamplight that filtered through the crack beneath his door, he looked younger than his years, younger than his worries, younger than his accumulated knowledge, younger than everything except the essential, irreducible core of himself. That part that had been there before he learned to read, and that would be there after he forgot how. That part that was not shaped by scrolls or libraries or the opinions of other people, but was simply, purely, undefinably him. Outside, the rain began to ease. It did not stop. It would continue on and off through the night, tapering and resuming, fading and returning. A conversation between the sky and the earth that would last until dawn. But it softened again to its gentlest register, its quietest voice, a sound so delicate and so refined that it was almost indistinguishable from silence. And in that space between sound and silence, in that liminal zone where the rain was neither falling nor not falling, but simply being, the city of Alexandria settled into its deepest rest, and the great library of Alexandria, that repository of all human knowledge, that monument to the belief that the world could be understood, and that understanding could be preserved, stood quiet and still and dark. Its 400,000 scrolls safe within their shelves, its corridors empty, its doors open, waiting for the morning, waiting for the scholars and the scribes and the students and the travelers and the insomniac philosophers. excited young readers, and all the others who would come and go and read and write and think and argue and wonder, waiting with the patience of a place that had seen centuries pass and would. It believed, rightly or wrongly, wisely or foolishly, see centuries more. But that was tomorrow. This was now. And now was rain and silence and darkness and sleep. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The rain fell softly on the roof, and the world was quiet, and the night was deep. And if you were to close your eyes now, if you were to let your breathing slow and your muscles loosen and your thoughts drift the way leaves drift on a gentle stream, you might almost hear it. Not the rain outside your own window, perhaps, but the rain inside this story. The rain that fell on Alexandria, and the library, and the garden, and the man who walked in it. The rain that was not really rain at all, but a kind of permission. Permission to rest, permission to stop, permission to be exactly where you are, and exactly who you are, without needing to be anywhere else or anyone else, without needing to do or achieve or understand or improve, just for this moment, just for this night. The rain is falling. The library is quiet. Close your eyes. Rest. He did not know how long he had been asleep when the dream came. If dream was even the right word for it. It was not like other dreams he had known. Other dreams had narratives, however fractured. Other dreams had characters, however shifting. Other dreams had the quality of a play performed on a stage that was somehow also inside his own skull, with all the attendant drama and confusion and sudden, inexplicable emotion that dreams carry like hidden cargo. This was not that. This was something else entirely. He was standing in the library, not in his small study with its 200 scrolls, but in the main hall, the great hall, the one that visitors always remembered, the one that appeared in their accounts and letters and memoirs with a consistency that suggested a shared experience rather than an individual perception. The hall was enormous. It had been designed to be enormous because its creators had understood that knowledge, when gathered in sufficient quantities, requires a certain scale of container, not for practical reasons, though there were practical reasons enough, but for philosophical ones. The scrolls needed room to breathe. The ideas needed space to expand. The readers needed a sense of vastness that would remind them, each time they entered, that what they were encountering here was larger than any single mind could comprehend, and that this was not a cause for despair, but for wonder. Callistratus had stood in this hall 1,000 times. He knew its dimensions the way a sailor knows the dimensions of his ship, not as numbers, but as feelings, as textures, as the lived, embodied experience of moving through a space that has become so familiar that it has merged with the self. He knew where the floor dipped slightly near the third column from the east wall. He knew which of the reading tables had a wobbly leg that could be stabilized with a folded piece of papyrus placed underneath. He knew the quality of light at different times of day. The thin, cool brilliance of the morning, when the sun poured through the high, clear-story windows and turned the dust motes into floating galaxies. The warm, golden richness of the afternoon, when the light slanted in from the west and painted the scroll shelves in shades of amber and honey. The dim, blue-gray stillness of the evening when the lamps were lit, and the shadows gathered in the corners like quiet animals settling in for the night. But he had never seen the hall quite like this. In the dream, in whatever this was, the hall was empty of people, but full of something else, full of a presence, not a ghost, not a deity, not anything that could be named or categorized or understood through the frameworks that his scholarly training provided. It was simply a presence, a sense that the room was not merely containing objects, but was inhabited by them. The scrolls on their shelves were not dormant, but quietly, secretly, intensely alive. That the knowledge they held was not static information, but living thought, pulsing with the same invisible energy that made the heart beat and the rain fall and the stars burn. Callistratus stood very still and felt the presence wash over him. It was not frightening. It was not even surprising exactly. It was more like the feeling of stepping into a bath that is exactly the right temperature, a feeling of perfect fit, of arriving at a place you did not know you were going, but that, now that you are here, you realize you have been seeking all along. The scrolls began to speak, not with voices. There were no voices, no words, no language in any conventional sense. But they communicated, they expressed. Each scroll on its shelf gave off some faint, invisible emanation that Callistratus received not through his ears, but through some other faculty, some sense that he did not know he possessed until this moment, a sense that was tuned not to sound or light or smell, but to meaning itself. He could feel the mathematics scrolls vibrating with a cold, precise, crystalline energy that was like the feeling of looking at a perfectly geometric crystal, orderly, inevitable, beautiful in a way that bypassed the emotions entirely and spoke directly to some deeper faculty of appreciation. He could feel the poetry scrolls radiating something warmer, more fluid, more unpredictable, an energy that moved and shifted like sunlight on water, that suggested rather than declared, that hinted at depths beneath its surface that could never be fully plumbed. He could feel the historical scrolls emitting a steady, grounded, sedimentary presence, like the feeling of holding a very old stone in your hand, and knowing that it had been shaped by forces operating on a time scale far beyond the human, and mixed in among these recognizable categories, these familiar taxonomies that the library's organizers had spent decades refining. There were other presences, other energies that did not fit any classification. Scrolls that seemed to contain not information, but feeling, not descriptions of emotions, but the emotions themselves, preserved somehow in the papyrus, like insects preserved in amber, still vital, still warm, still capable of being felt by anyone who opened them with the right kind of attention. The scrolls that seemed to contain not thoughts, but states of mind, whole ways of seeing the world, complete with their own internal logic and their own unique textures of perception that could be slipped into like a garment and worn briefly by any reader willing to set aside their own assumptions long enough to try. Callistratus moved slowly through the hall, drifting rather than walking, and as he passed each section of shelves, he received these emanations like gifts, like raindrops, like the individual notes of a symphony that was being played not for an audience, but for the pure, intrinsic joy of its own sounding. He did not try to hold onto any of them. He did not try to analyze or compare or evaluate. He simply let them pass through him, each one leaving its trace, its residue, its faint but unmistakable impression on the surface of his consciousness, and then moving on, making room for the next. He reached the center of the hall and stopped. Above him, the ceiling was lost in shadow. Even in the dream, even with whatever enhanced perception this state had granted him, he could not see the ceiling. It was as though the hall extended upward, not into architecture, but into sky, into the actual sky, the night sky, the rain sky. And the rain was falling here too, inside the hall, falling through the open space above and landing on the scrolls and the shelves and the tables and the floor. And the scrolls were not getting wet. The water passed through them as though they were made of light, and the presence in the room expanded and deepened as the rain fell, as though the water were not merely a weather event, but a medium of connection, a way for the sky to touch the earth and the earth to touch the sky, and all the accumulated knowledge of the human race to be briefly, gently, tenderly held in the space between. Callistratus looked up at the falling rain and felt something inside himself open. Not a dramatic opening, not a door flung wide or a dam burst, but a slow, gradual, organic opening, like the opening of a flower, like the opening of an eye, like the opening of a hand that has been clenched for a very long time and has finally, for whatever reason, decided to let go. He let go of what exactly he could not have said. Not of the rain. The rain was not something to be held or released. Not of the dream. The dream was not something to be controlled. Not of himself. He was not sure in this moment where he ended and the dream began, and the distinction seemed, in any case, unimportant. He let go of something more fundamental than any of these. Something like the need to understand, the need to name, the need to translate every experience into language so that it could be filed away and retrieved later and used as evidence in the ongoing case that the mind was always building against the world's refusal to make sense. He let go of the case. He let the evidence scatter. He let the world be what it was: vast, mysterious, beautiful, incomprehensible, rainy. And he let himself be what he was: small, tired, wondering, grateful, wet. And he let the two exist in the same space without trying to reconcile them, without trying to reduce one to the other, without trying to build a bridge between them out of words and concepts and theories. And in the space where the bridge should have been, where the gap between self and world yawned open with its ancient, unfillable darkness, something appeared. Not a bridge, not an explanation, not a revelation, something much simpler and much more ordinary and much more miraculous than any of those. A feeling, just a feeling of belonging, not belonging in the sense of membership or affiliation or group identity, not the belonging of a citizen to a city or a scholar to a library or a man to a family. Something deeper than that, something older, the belonging of a raindrop to the rain, the belonging of a wave to the sea, the belonging of a breath to the air, the belonging of a moment to the infinite, unbroken stream of moments that constitutes the life of the world. Callistratus stood in the center of the great hall of the library of Alexandria, in a dream that was not quite a dream, and he felt himself belong to the rain and to the library and to the night and to the city and to the sea and to the earth and to the sky and to the stars that he could not see, but that he knew were there, behind the clouds, behind the rain, behind the darkness, burning with their ancient, patient, indifferent light. The feeling did not last. Feelings never last. That is part of their nature, part of what makes them precious. It faded slowly, the way the rain fades when a storm moves out to sea, leaving behind a sky that is not yet clear, but is no longer full, a sky that is in transition, that is between things, that is holding its breath before the next phase of its existence begins. But it left something behind, not a memory exactly. Memories were too static, too fixed, too much like the dried ink on a scroll to capture what had happened. Something more like a capacity, a knowing, a sense buried somewhere deep in the body, below the level of thought, below the level of language, that what he had experienced was real. Not real in the way that a table or a scroll or a mathematical proof is real, but real in the way that rain is real and silence is real, and the space between two notes of music is real. Real as presence rather than as object. real as experience rather than as information, real as the thing that happens when you stop looking for reality and allow yourself instead to be lived by it. The dream dissolved, not dramatically. There was no sense of falling or waking or snapping back to consciousness. It simply thinned, the way mist thins in the morning, becoming less dense, less opaque, less distinct, until what had seemed solid and real revealed itself to be nothing more than a particular arrangement of light and air and attention. And then it was gone, and Callistratus was lying in his narrow bed in Theno's boarding house, and the rain was falling on the roof above him, and the night was deep, and his body was heavy with sleep, and his mind was quiet in a way that it had not been quiet before the dream, in a way that felt not like the absence of thought, but like the presence of something that was not thought, a background hum of peace, of stillness, of rest that went deeper than the rest of the body and reached into some part of him that did not have a name and did not need one. He opened his eyes. The room was dark. The lamp had gone out at some point. The oil must have been consumed while he slept, and the only light came from the same thin blade of gray that seeped through the crack beneath the door and around the edges of the shuttered window. It was not enough light to see by in any practical sense, but it was enough to make the darkness not total, enough to give the room a sense of dimension and presence, enough to remind him where he was without requiring him to fully engage with the fact. He lay still and listened. The rain had changed again. It was heavier now than it had been when he fell asleep. Not a downpour, not a storm, but a steady, determined, middleweight rain that fell with the confidence of something that knows it will be here for a while and sees no reason to rush. The sound on the roof was different from the sound in the garden or the library, closer, more intimate, more textured. He could hear individual drops now, or rather, he could hear small clusters of drops, groups of 2 or 3 or 4 that struck the tiles in quick succession and produced a tiny, complex chord that resonated for a fraction of a second before being absorbed by the next group, and the next, and the next, creating a continuous, shifting tapestry of sound that was never the same from one moment to the next, but was always, in its essential character, rain. There was another sound beneath the rain, so faint that he might have been imagining it, but he did not think he was. A humming, a vibration, not musical, not mechanical, but somewhere between the two. A low, steady tone that seemed to come from the walls themselves, as though the building were singing in its sleep. It was probably the wind, he reasoned, the wind moving through some gap or channel in the stonework, producing a resonance that was too low and too consistent to be noticed during the day, but that emerged at night when the other sounds were stilled as a distinct and separate presence. Or perhaps it was not the wind. Perhaps it was the building itself, the stones, the mortar, the timber, vibrating with the accumulated energy of all the lives that had passed through it, all the conversations that had been held within its walls, all the meals that had been cooked in its kitchen, all the tears that had been cried into its pillows, all the laughter that had echoed in its corridors. Buildings absorb things. This was something that Callistratus believed, though he could not have proved it with any of the analytical tools available to him. Buildings absorb the sounds and feelings and thoughts of their inhabitants, and they hold them, and they release them slowly over time in the way that the earth releases the heat of the day after the sun has set, not all at once, but gradually, invisibly, as a gentle warmth that can be felt even when its source is no longer present. If buildings could hold such things, then Theno's boarding house held a great deal. It held the weariness of travelers arriving after long journeys. It held the excitement of young scholars who had come to Alexandria for the first time and who lay awake in their narrow beds, listening to the sounds of the strange city, unable to sleep for the sheer volume of newness that their senses were trying to process. It held the quiet contentment of people who had found, in this modest room, in this modest building, a temporary home, a place where they could close the door and be alone with themselves for a few hours before the world demanded their attention again. It held the rain, years of rain, decades of rain, every storm that had ever passed over Alexandria had left some trace of itself in these walls, and the traces had accumulated layer upon layer, like the rings of a tree, and the sound that Callistratus was hearing, or thought he was hearing, was the sum of all those traces, the combined resonance of 1,000 rainy nights, vibrating softly in the stones. He liked this idea. He did not know whether it was true, and he did not care. It was a beautiful idea, and it comforted him. And in the middle of the night, in the rain, in the dark, that was enough. He shifted on the bed, turning onto his side, and the straw mattress rustled beneath him with a sound like dry leaves. He pulled the thin blanket up to his chin and curled his legs slightly, adopting the fetal position that the body instinctively seeks when it wants to feel safe and contained and small. His knees were cool where they touched each other. His feet were cold. His toes, in particular, seemed to have lost whatever warmth they had accumulated during sleep, and they felt like small, smooth stones pressed against the back of his calves. He wiggled them, not to warm them, but just to feel them move, to confirm that they were still attached, still part of him, still capable of responding to the quiet directives of his will. The mind in the deep night is a strange and wonderful place. It is not the same mind that operates during the day. The focused, purposeful, socially calibrated mind that navigates conversations and solves problems and remembers to buy olives. The night mind is wilder, freer, less bound by the rules of logic and linearity that govern waking thought. It makes connections that the day mind would dismiss as absurd. It asks questions that the day mind would consider pointless. It wanders through landscapes that have no correspondence to any physical geography, following paths that appear and disappear without warning, crossing rivers that flow upward and climbing mountains that are made of nothing but light. Callistratus's night mind, released from the constraints of sleep by the gentle interruption of his waking, began to drift. It drifted to the scroll about the African rivers, the one he had been reading before the rain called him away from his desk. He saw the rivers in his mind's eye, not as words on papyrus, but as actual rivers, wide and brown and slow, flowing through landscapes of such staggering vastness that the Greek travelers' descriptions, vivid as they were, could not begin to capture their scale. He saw the mountains that the traveler had mentioned, and they were not the modest, rounded hills of Macedonia, but immense, flat-topped formations that rose from the plain like tables set for the feasting of giants. Their surfaces dark with vegetation, their flanks scarred by valleys, so deep they looked like wounds in the body of the earth. He saw the animals. The traveler had described them with a mixture of awe and bewilderment, creatures that were like nothing in the Greek experience, that defied every category, that seemed to have been assembled by some playful or deranged deity from the spare parts of other, more orderly species. Callistratus saw them now, moving through the landscape of his half-sleep with a fluid, unhurried grace that made them seem not like animals at all, but like embodiments of the landscape itself, as though the earth had shaped them from its own substance and set them moving across its surface as a way of experiencing itself from different perspectives. There was an elephant. No, there were many elephants. A herd, moving in a line across a plain that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Their footsteps were silent in his vision, though he knew that in reality they must have made a tremendous noise, because elephants were enormous, enormous beyond the capacity of language to convey, and enormous things moving through the world inevitably left their mark. But in his vision, they were silent, and their silence made them seem even larger, even more improbable, even more dreamlike, as though silence were a quality that only truly immense things could possess. He watched them for a while, how long he could not say. And then the vision shifted as visions do, and he was no longer watching the elephants, but was inside the library again, standing before a shelf that he had never noticed before, in a section of the building that he had never visited. The scrolls on this shelf were different from the others. They were older, visibly, palpably older, their papyrus yellowed and brittle, their rolling handles made not of wood, but of bone, smooth and yellowed with age. The writing on their labels was in a script that Callistratus did not recognize, and the labels themselves were not in Greek or Egyptian or any of the other languages that he had encountered in his years at the library, but in something else, something that looked like writing, but that functioned somehow more like music, with symbols that seemed to indicate not meanings, but tones, not words, but intervals, not statements, but harmonies. He reached for one of the scrolls. His hand moved slowly, as though through water, and he could feel the scroll's presence before he touched it. A warmth, a vibration, a faint but unmistakable hum, as though the scroll were not an object, but a living thing. A coiled spring of compressed meaning that was waiting to be released. His fingers closed around the bone handle, and the warmth intensified and he began to unroll the scroll, and the symbols on its surface began to move, to shift, to rearrange themselves into patterns that were not quite pictures and not quite words and not quite music, but something that contained elements of all three. And the patterns began to resonate with something inside his chest. Not his heart, not his lungs, but something behind them, something deeper, something that had been there his whole life, but that he had never been aware of until this moment. And then the pattern shifted again, and he was no longer in the library, and the scroll was no longer in his hands, and he was no longer asleep, but awake, or mostly awake, or awake enough to know that he was lying in a bed, in a room, in a building, in a city, in a rainstorm, and that the thing he had just experienced was not real in the way that tables and chairs and rainstorms were real, but was real in some other way that he could not name and did not need to name. He lay in the darkness and breathed. The rain was still falling. It had been falling when he fell asleep the first time, and it had been falling when he drifted into the dream, and it had been falling when the dream dissolved, and it was falling now, and it would continue to fall, perhaps for hours, perhaps until dawn, perhaps longer. This was the nature of rain in Alexandria. It came from the sea, and it returned to the sea, and in between it passed through the city and the library and the gardens and the harbors and the lives of the people who lived there, touching everything with its wet, cool, clean, impersonal fingers. And then it was gone, evaporated, risen, transformed into vapor and cloud, and the invisible reservoir of moisture that hung above the Mediterranean and waited for the right combination of temperature and pressure and wind to become rain again. Callistratus thought about this cycle not analytically, not with the focused attention of a scholar trying to understand a process, but with the loose, floating, half-attached attention of a man in bed in the dark, who has no particular reason to think about anything, and who is therefore free to think about everything. The water that was falling on his roof at this moment had, at some previous point in its existence, been part of the sea. Before that, it might have been part of a river, the Nile, perhaps, or the Orontes, or one of the nameless streams that fed into the Mediterranean from the mountains of Europe and Asia and Africa. Before that, it might have been part of a cloud, and before that, part of the sea again, and before that, part of a glacier on some northern mountain, and before that. How far back could you go? How many iterations of the cycle could a single molecule of water survive? Was there a first raindrop, a primordial precipitation that fell on the young earth before there were eyes to see it or minds to wonder about it? And if there was that raindrop still here, somewhere, in some form, frozen in an ice cap, or dissolved in the ocean, or falling on the roof of a boarding house in Alexandria on a night in the 2nd century before the Common Era, touching the tiles and running down the walls and seeping into the ground and beginning its journey through the cycle all over again. These were not new questions. The philosophers had asked them centuries ago and had proposed answers that ranged from the sublime to the ridiculous. But tonight, lying in the dark, Callistratus did not want answers. He wanted the questions. He wanted the feeling of asking them, the feeling of standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, and letting the vastness and the unknownness wash over him without trying to build a bridge or a boat or a theory to carry him across. The questions were enough. The wondering was enough. The not knowing was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be experienced, a space to be inhabited, a kind of darkness that was not empty, but full of possibility, full of potential, full of the same creative energy that had made the rain and the sea and the stars and the 400,000 scrolls in the library, and the mind that was lying in this bed thinking about them. He turned onto his other side. The mattress rustled again. blanket settled around him in a slightly different configuration, leaving a small gap at his shoulder where the cool air crept in. And he did not fix it because the coolness was pleasant, a small, sharp contrast to the warmth of the blanket, and the bed that made the warmth more noticeable, more present, more appreciated. His mind drifted again, not into dream this time, but into something adjacent to dream, a state that was too aware to be sleep and too relaxed to be waking, a border territory where the normal rules of thought did not apply, and where the mind was free to follow its own meandering course without interference from the will. He thought about his mother, not about any specific memory of her, but about her presence, the felt sense of her that lived somewhere in his body, in the way he breathed, in the way he held his hands, in the way he responded to certain sounds and smells and textures. She had died 5 years ago in the same house in the Macedonian hills where he had grown up, in the same room where she had borne him, and he had not been there. He had been in Alexandria, 3 weeks' journey away, reading a scroll about the trade routes of the Black Sea, and the news had reached him a week after the funeral, carried by a traveling merchant who knew a man who knew a man who knew his brother. And the news had been delivered in a single sentence: "Your mother has died." And the sentence had entered him like a blade, and had remained there, buried in some deep part of his chest, for 5 years. He did not think about this with pain tonight. The pain was still there. He knew it was there. The way you know a scar is there even when you can't see it. But tonight, in the rain, in the dark, in the borderland between waking and sleeping, the pain was not sharp. It was dull and warm and distant, like a fire seen from a great distance, present but not threatening, acknowledged but not consuming. He felt his mother's presence the way he felt the rain on the roof, as something external that was also, somehow, internal, something that came from outside. resonated with something inside, something that had always been there, and that would always be there, regardless of the vagaries of weather or circumstance or the human lifespan. She had loved the rain too. He remembered that now, not as a specific memory, but as a felt certainty, a bone-deep knowing that was more reliable than any particular recollection. She had stood in the doorway of their home on rainy evenings and watched the sky with an expression that he had never been able to interpret.